Also from my side, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this event as the Bundesbank celebrates its 60th birthday. Let me start by taking us all back in time to a day almost 10 years ago. Imagine, we are in December 19th, 2008. So this is 3 months after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. And it is clear that the world economy is going in deep recession. Can you feel the rising level of nervousness? The room temperature just went up. Some of the bankers sweat on the forehead. Sense of impending doom. So on December 19th, on that day, the US weekly magazine Newsweek reports as follows. They are technocrats, schooled in subjects that bore most people. They are appointed, not elected, to top government jobs. And what they do is not well understood. But they are enormously powerful. And in 2009, they may determine whether the global economy avoids calamity. They are central bankers. Ben Bernanke of the US Federal Reserve, Jean-Claude Trichet of the European Central Bank, Masaaki Shirakawa of the Bank of Japan. So this is a quote. Newsweek called these three men the economic triumvirate and ranked them on places 4, 5, and 6 in its ranking of the 50 most powerful people in the world on the planet Earth in 2008. At that time, Jean-Claude Trichet had already served 5 years as ECB president since November 2003, following a 10-year-long tenure as governor of the Banque de France and a distinguished career in the service of the government of France. Masaaki Shirakawa had been at the helm of the Bank of Japan for just about 8 months. Yet, he was also a very experienced central banker, having joined the Bank of Japan as a staff person way back in 1972, and having just returned from a brief 2-year stint as an academic at Kyoto University. Axel Weber, though not on the Newsweek list, was not far away from it either. In December 2008, he had already served 4.5 years as the governor of the Deutsche Bundesbank and was considered a very influential voice on the ECB's governing council. He had been appointed to the bank in 2004, following a distinguished career as an academic, including a time as a colleague on the faculty of Goethe University. Due to the ongoing financial crisis, Axel Weber had already been involved advising Angela Merkel, number 8 on the Newsweek 50 list, in how to avoid a collapse of the banking system. And our host, Jens Weidmann, had actually been right in there in those meetings as the top economic advisor and G8, G20 Sherpa at the time. So from 2008 onwards, these three economists seated right there, we're going to shape, and we're shaping the unconventional monetary policies deployed at the central banks in the euro area and Japan. Their objectives included to maintain financial stability, to support economic activity, and to return to price stability and positive rates of inflation. While the ECB was new to this game, with low inflation, low interest rates, the Bank of Japan had been grappling with how to formulate and implement monetary policy in an environment of near-zero interest rates and inflation since the late 1990s. Now, Newsweek concluded substantial pressures for central banks to restore economic growth and said there is not so much cooperation as a shared fear grounded in scholarly discussions, scholarly conclusions about the Great Depression. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, these three economists are uniquely positioned to explain, teach, and discuss with us the benefits and boundaries of these unconventional monetary policies. And being out of central bank office, they can speak freely. Jean-Claude Trichet's term ended in 2011. Of course, he remains very active, for example, as chairman of the board of directors of the Bruegel Institute and the Trilateral Commission. Masaaki Shirakawa left the BOJ in 2013. He's now a professor at a university in Tokyo. And Axel Weber left the Bundesbank in 2011. And as you know, he went into the private sector to lead UBS out of trouble in his role as chairman of the board of directors. The plan for this session is as follows. We start with initial statements by our three panelists, 5 to 6 minutes. We go in alphabetical order. Afterwards, we have a bit of an exchange among ourselves with the panelists. I'm trying to stimulate that a little bit. I don't think there will be much need, and then we'll open up to the audience, and we're counting on you to ask the really hard questions. Thank you. So I may ask Professor Shirakawa up first, and then we go one after the other without questions in between the statements.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Volker Wieland, for your kind introduction. I would like to contribute to the discussion about unconventional monetary policy by organizing my remarks around Japanese experience, which is unique in the following sense. First, Japan has 20 years experience of unconventional monetary policy as a frontier. In fact, when Japan was deploying unconventional monetary policy in early 2000, I never thought that my counterpart at foreign central bank would adopt them in future. Japan was a very lonely forerunner until the onset of global financial crisis not only in terms of policy action itself, but also in terms of identification of issues involved. And second, Japan was a sort of laboratory in that Japan deployed almost all kinds of unconventional monetary policy measures, including operation as a lender of last resort and market maker of last resort, massive expansion of central bank balance sheet, forward guidance, purchase of private assets such as stocks, ETFs, and REITs, negative interest rate, and more recently, yield curve control, to name a few. Out of potential toolkit of unconventional monetary policy, measures that Japan has not yet tried so far are only two: an unlimited purchase of foreign exchange, and express coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, which is now advocated by some prominent economists. My assessment of the effectiveness of unconventional monetary policy in advanced economy is the following. Although this is inherently difficult, simply because we cannot know the counterfactual. First, many emergency measures taken in crisis were quite effective in preventing collapse of financial system, credit intermediation, or market making. These measures were sometimes dubbed as QE, but this phraseology is quite misleading. These were essentially deployment of time-honored role of lender of last resort. Second, unconventional monetary policy was effective on the whole in affecting prices of financial assets. If central banks purchase financial assets on a really massive scale, however, its effect on exchange rate is still not clear. An interesting case is the attempt to peg Swiss franc exchange rate by Swiss National Bank. It was successful in the sense that flow of Swiss franc was maintained for as long as 4 years. It failed in the sense that Swiss National Bank was eventually forced to withdraw from such a commitment. Third, the effect of unconventional monetary policy on real economy was rather limited. This sober assessment is simply based on the fact that there is no material difference of the path of GDP between Japan in 1990s, where unconventional monetary policy as such was not deployed, and US, Eurozone, and UK in post-global financial crisis period, where unconventional monetary policy was deployed. I am skipping the chart. I have prepared the chart, but in the interval time, I'm skipping the explanation of that, but you can confirm this easily. Fourth, it is too early to tell full impact of unconventional monetary policy because we have to weigh any positive effect of unconventional monetary policy stemming from the rise in prices of financial assets against its symmetrical negative impact due to unwinding of unconventional monetary policy and political and social impact as well. As I understand it, a reasonable consensus has not yet emerged except for the first and the second point, which I mentioned. Now I'd like to focus on the issues which I think Japanese experience provides unique food for thought. The first is the durability of the effectiveness of unconventional monetary policy. At the end of the day, Japan has been deploying unconventional monetary policy over the period spanning 2 decades. A decline in market rate engineered by unconventional monetary policy could bring future demand to the present and hence raise growth and inflation rate accordingly. But this is essentially intertemporal substitution. To the extent that it is effective today, it becomes less effective tomorrow. On top of that, if pursued aggressively, it creates too much debt and thus threatens financial stability ultimately. In my view, the strategy of unconventional monetary policy is meaningful if a shock hitting the economy is temporal. If not, it is not the solution. For example, the problem of my own country is not solved by shifting timing of expenditure. The fundamental challenge facing Japanese economy is mainly due to rapid decline of working age population and hence decline in natural rate of interest rate. The second is the global dimension of unconventional monetary policy. If only a small number of countries are hit by shocks in the face of zero lower bound of interest rate, strategy of unconventional monetary policy could be effective. A case in point is Japan before global financial crisis. At the time, only Japan was faced with practically zero lower bound of interest rate. A gradual tightening by US and others in mid-2000 created a divergence of monetary policy, leading to yen's depreciation, which stimulated Japanese economy until global financial crisis erupted. Japan's monetary policy strategy at the time was essentially waiting for the arrival of tailwind. If tailwind blows, exchange rate channel of unconventional monetary policy becomes effective. The issue here is where unconventional monetary policy is effective in case entire global economy is hit by a common shock. The mainstream view is that even in this case, putting one's house in order by deploying unconventional monetary policy in each country could lead to desirable outcome at both domestic and global level. This rejects the view that unconventional monetary policy becomes beggar thy neighbor policy. For me, this view is quite naive and does not capture the real challenge faced by Japan, for instance. When global economy was hit by a common shock, say collapse of Lehman Brothers or European debt crisis, almost all countries conducted further monetary easing by adopting unconventional monetary policy. But as global uncertainty elevated, a small number of currencies were chosen as a safe haven currency. Japanese yen was one such currency, together with Swiss franc. Although Japan was hit by strong deflationary impact due to yen's appreciation, it was not equipped with necessary instrument simply because of its constellation of yield curve. The yield curve on 10-year JGB was as low as 1.3% before Lehman collapse, while the yield on 10-year US and European bond was 4.5%. Simply, Japan had no way to create monetary policy divergence in favor of exchange rate depreciation. Although this might be a digression, I would like to note the argument of redundancy problem or N-1 problem coined by Robert Mandel in late 1960s. In a world of N number of currencies, n-1 number of exchange rate exists, and nth country cannot choose its own exchange rate level. In a Bretton Woods system, nth country was supposedly the US, which could affect global financial conditions by issuing reserve currency. But in a world characterized by zero lower bound of interest rate, which was beyond anyone's imagination back in the 1960s, nth country was Japan and Switzerland. We cannot rule out the possibility that global unconventional monetary policy on a massive scale will eventually lead to zero-sum game if no country cares about global implications. The third is political and social dimension of unconventional monetary policy. Unconventional monetary policy tends to create perverse incentive on the part of private sector as well as government and or politicians to weaken incentive to implement structural reform to boost potential growth rate and restore fiscal sustainability. If the shock hitting the economy is not temporary but structural, slow progress of structural reform becomes a really serious problem. In fact, central banks often become the only game in town. Many people attribute this phenomenon to the fact that structural policy is unpopular. But this diagnosis is somewhat inaccurate or not sincere. Independent and accountable central banks feel obliged to do something against weak growth. Government can count on short-run stimulus effect without implementing painful reform. People at large trust what government, politicians, and central banks are saying. Strange social dynamics is being created. An internet question is the relevancy of so-called Tim Bergen's principle and policy assignment in this complicated world. The standard argument goes as follows. First, if we have n number of policy goals, we need n number of policy instruments. Second, each policy instrument should be assigned to the goal for which it is most effective. According to this view, monetary policy is assigned to price stability, financial regulation is assigned to financial stability, and structural policy is assigned to boosting productivity. But I cannot be sanguine about this kind of demarcation of policy in a world where prolonged monetary easing is creating too much debt as well as weakening the incentive for structural reform. To sum up, it is quite legitimate for central banks to have deployed unconventional monetary policy in the face of crisis. Unconventional monetary policy was effective as a measure to avoid the collapse of the financial system. But we should not overestimate the effect of unconventional monetary policy on inflation and growth in a traditional sense of monetary policy. In addition, we should be mindful about possible adverse long-run effects. There are many issues that warrant careful consideration before the next crisis comes. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure, Jens, to be there at your invitation. I am impressed to see a lot of friends, mainly old friends, I have to say, because time has elapsed a little bit. I have a very vivid memory of the 50th anniversary of the Bundesbank, and fancy that 10 years have already elapsed is for me amazing. Now, let me also mention two names, if I may now. Wherever I am in the world, I go in the world, Mario Monti, the former eminent Prime Minister of Italy, is there and is giving his own wisdom. And Otmar Issing is also there, whether in London or in Washington or everywhere else. So I can benefit from their wisdom. But a lot of other friends are here, and I'm very happy to be here. We are given a very limited number of minutes in order to let sufficient time for the discussion. So I hope that you will consider my remarks as only title of chapters for questions. I would make four main remarks. One on the multidimensionality of the objectives of non-conventional monetary policy measures. one of the diversity of the instruments that we call non-conventional measures, one of the other partners that need to be on board, and I would echo very much what was already said, including by Masaaki a moment ago, and I will conclude on what I call conceptual convergence and what it means at the level of the advanced economy monetary policies. First, multidimensionality of the objectives. I think that we all agree on the fact that we had to do something in the time of the acute crisis that was observed in 07-08, mainly after Lehman Brothers collapse in 08. And we all agree that there we were on the verge of an absolute catastrophe, looking very much like the Great Depression in terms of intensity and gravity and I would say rapidity of the unfolding of the contagion. That was really the first response that we had as central bankers, embarking very, very boldly and swiftly on new measures. Of course, that had been already experienced, I have to say, in Japan, but were totally new for the US and for Europe. And we are considered, rightly so, extremely swift, but extremely bold, too. And that was to cope with what I would say the first dimension of the non-standard measures, namely cope immediately, as soon as possible, with acute crisis. Then you could call that the crisis management dimension. Everybody agrees on that. At this stage, there is no necessarily correlation between the level of interest rates, the traditional, conventional measures, and the level of intensity of the new measures that are taken. When we started to embark on non-conventional measures on the US and in Europe, we had interest rates that were not at zero level. A second dimension, which I trust is also extremely important, and perhaps from time to time forgotten, is that in a second dimension of the non-standard measures, we have to cope with the fact that even if we do not have an acute crisis about to destroy the financial system and the real economy, we have to substitute to a private sector which is not functioning correctly. And so the central banks have to partially or totally substitute to private sector intermediation. Allusion were made to that by both, I would say, our moderator and by Masaaki, when you had in France, in Europe as a whole, in Germany, and of course in the United States, a money market which was not functioning, and the central bank had to substitute to this money market. In our case, in Europe, it was mainly through the full allotment at fixed rate that we did that. In the US, it was through a very large purchase of treasuries. That was because we were in different universe in Europe and in the US. We had ourselves banks financing, say, 75% of the European economy. In the US, it was the market which were financing 75% of the economy. Not surprisingly, we concentrated on permitting the financing of our economies on both sides of the Atlantic to be done in a correct fashion. In both cases, the central bank had to step in extremely boldly and swiftly, as I already said. For that second dimension, also, one could say there is not necessarily a 100% correlation between the conventional measures, interest rate, and the non-conventional measures. And by the way, when we introduced on both sides of the Atlantic this second dimension of the non-conventional measures, interest rates were not at zero level. Now, there is a third understanding, a third dimension of the unconventional measures, which is, I'm oversimplifying, pursuing monetary policy at the zero lower bound. Zero lower bound meaning around zero or even below zero in some cases, as is the case in Europe or in a number of other advanced economy. There, of course, there is, in this third dimension, a correlation between the conventional measures and the non-conventional measures. And one can say that it is the only case where you must have, or you should have, 100% correlation. We could see in the United States of America that then, whilst reinvesting in the maturities that were falling due, for the equivalent of the maturities that were falling due, interest rates were not at a zero level, and still it appeared necessary in the eyes of the Federal Reserve that some kind, what I interpret myself, of the second goal of the non-conventional quantitative measures should be pursued. So that's for my first remark. Second remark, we should not neglect the dimensionality of the non-conventional measures themselves. I already mentioned the fact that in Europe we had the full allotment at fixed rate as our main goal. Jens mentioned that, and it was our first response, a very, very important response. I draw your attention to the fact that it is some kind of an off-balance sheet commitment. We were telling all the commercial banks, if we have an immense problem that is not necessarily projected to materialize immediately, in any case, you're sure that all your collateral can be transformed in liquidity because there is a promise of the central bank. That promise is still there. I insist on that because when discussing with my US friends, very often they did not understand what represented exactly the full allotment at fixed rate that we had introduced, even, I have to say, as a concept, even before 08, because as you all remember, in the 9th of August 2007, at the moment where the subprime crisis exploded, we had the first decision to embark on this full allotment at fixed rate at the time. Not generalized, but one operation which proved to be efficient and effective. I remember, Axel, some of our discussion on the phone in the aftermath of this decision to try to measure exactly what was happening. Another dimension which does not exist, of course, in the United States or even in Japan is the OMT. The OMT is also an off-balance sheet commitment, which proved in the time of its decision to be effective, and which was never implemented because there was no need. But as far as off-balance sheet commitment, note that they are very much ignored, in my understanding, by observers and economists, even if they are very important and are specific to Europe. If we were not a central bank in the ECB, but a private sector institution, everybody would look at the off-balance sheet commitment and consider that they are very, very important to judge the overall, I would say, position, activity, creditworthiness, and so forth of that particular private entity. In the case of our own European off-balance sheet commitment, they are very much ignored, and I think it's probably a mistake. Now, I could go on because the complexity of the forward guidance as practiced in the various central banks is also to be noted. The European QE doesn't look as other QE in the world because, as you know, most of the risks are taken at the level of the national central banks and not at the level of the system as a whole, which is a difference with the OMT. So we could certainly be, in my opinion, more aware of the complexity of the non-standard measure. That being said, I go to my third remark, introductory remark. It is clear that in Japan, as well as in the US, as well as in the UK, as well as Europe, the central banks are all calling the other partners to step in. They all are saying in various form, taking into account also their own culture, their own historical records, if I may, but they are all telling governments, parliaments, and social partners You have to step in. We cannot be the only game in town. And that, unfortunately, is not communicated by, I would say, the system of communication in our democracy in a sufficiently forceful fashion. Still, when I look at what the central bank in Japan says, the third row is not yet coming. The third row is still dans le carquois, if I may. In the United States of America, I could observe myself during this crisis the fact that the central bank was bolder and bolder in mentioning, for instance, fiscal policies or other policies that were judged by the central bank indispensable for the full success of the macro policies, including the monetary policy. In Europe, we had the tradition in Germany, in France, and in many other countries, in Italy, of addressing directly, the central bank addressing directly the, I would say, executive branches and the other partners. So it was in our tradition. And we continue to have this tradition, not only at the level of the ECB, and I read always very carefully what Mario says in terms of structural reforms that are overdue, with the full support, of course, of the Governing Council, and also what are telling the national central banks, each in their own democracy and communicating what should be done. But I have to say, I would be much more happy if those communications were going much more forcefully through all the communication network of our democracies. And that is, of course, absolutely necessary because the central bank cannot be the only game in town. This is absolutely certain. And to the extent that the central bank is responsible for price stability, and price stability means, as was decided in 2003, Mario, I have some memory of that, as less than 2, but close to 2, we still have, of course, not full satisfaction, even if the real economy is going much better. I'm speaking, of course, of Europe, but I could say more or less the same in the United States, and I guess I could say the same also in Japan, where when I look at growth per capita in Japan, it's not that bad. Still, of course, inflation is at a very low level. So this is an immense problem. But if we cannot rely upon appropriate understanding by our democracies that the central banks are not the only game in town and that we need structural reforms, and I hope very much that we will see that in my own country now that many conditions are met to embark resolutely on structural reforms, but I would also think that you have other partners to step in all over Europe, not only on the structural reform side, but also on the, I would say, social partner side. It's not normal with the level of full employment, for instance, that we have in some countries, and certainly in Germany, and with the level of current account surplus that we have, and with the level of profit that we have in the enterprises, that we do not have a little bit more dynamism of unit labor cost and wages and salaries. I know that the Bundesbank was bold enough at a time to hint at that, but it's true that it is certainly part of the appropriate, I would say, victory for price stability if we would be a little bit over and above 1.5% for national inflation in Germany, which seems to me is in the cards for the month of May. Now, let me conclude on conceptual convergence. As I said, I mentioned the multidimensionality of the monetary policies today, as well as for their goals or for their various instruments that are utilized. But if I take a more, I would say, global perspective on what the central banks of the advanced economy, mainly of the advanced economy, but of all economies have been doing, I see a lot of elements of convergence, and I will only list them without commenting. We all agree now that we have responsibility in financial stability, that there is a special take of the central banking constituency in preventing financial instability and systemic risk. We have a quasi-consensus on the fact that central banks could be very close, or should be very close, to banking surveillance, micro-banking surveillance. We are also very, very aware, it seems to me, much more than we were before the crisis, and I'm speaking particularly to Otmar, of the fact that credit dynamics are important to judge a monetary policy situation, that this idea that having two pillars is not as absurd as it was considered before the crisis, and what, with the benefit of the hindsight, appears quite absurd was to totally ignore credit dynamics and the component and counterparts of the monetary aggregates, which was, as you might remember, the mantra of the mainstream economists before the crisis. And I have to say also that we have this extraordinary convergence toward the same definition of price stability, which was not the case at all before the crisis. We were, with our friends of the UK, the only one to mention 2%, less than 2, but close to 2 or 2, before the crisis. Amongst the 4 central banks that were issuing the currencies that were in the basket of the SDR, the US joined in 2012, the Japan joined in 2013, so we are all now converging. We have already converged towards a definition of price stability which is very, very close for the major central banks of the advanced economy, those that are issuing currencies that are in the basket of the SDR. And of course, we know that the renminbi is there. But I would consider that this nominal anchoring of inflation at a global level is one of the most important elements that we have observed as a consequence of the crisis. In the crisis, I draw your attention to that, but we could reflect much more on that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, and let me start, as my previous speakers, by thanking the Bundesbank for inviting me to this conference. It's a pleasure. 60th anniversary of the Deutsche Bundesbank is a major achievement. I was born in the same year as the Bundesbank was founded, so I remember vividly the 50th anniversary that we had here in Frankfurt, and it was just a few months away, just actually 2 months away, before the banking problems erupted, and it was probably the last calm celebration. Things have been quite exciting since then. I want to focus my remarks on 2 areas. I want to be brief so we can have an exchange of views. So let me start by saying that concerning the benefits and boundaries of monetary policy, and I usually look at conventional and unconventional in the same way, the metaphor that I've been using for many years, and I heard it used in the room before, is, and I have no reason to change this view, that monetary policy can be a great fire extinguisher, a crisis-fighting tool, but I think it has little to contribute in rebuilding the house. And when you look at monetary policy, it is powerful in fighting the crisis. And I remember vividly when the crisis broke out, bringing interest rates down to very low level in a very fast speed, and using conventional tools like long-term financing operations and going beyond the usual horizons was, I think, a very powerful tool for providing security, for providing longevity in financial markets that were increasingly becoming short-term. But monetary policy as a tool to come out of the crisis has, in my view, some limitations. And when I look at that, and I just want to refer to a Group of 30 report that I had the pleasure to be on the steering committee, but both Jean-Claude and Masaaki had been in the group, where we tried to sort of look at the crisis and look at the real lessons from the crisis in 3 separate phases. One is the actual crisis intervention and firefighting. And I think their monetary policy and even unconventional monetary policy can play a role. The second one is crisis resolution, and that is getting out of the crisis. I think we're not yet at that phase, 10 years after the crisis. And so we haven't really got a lot of experience on crisis resolution. Some countries, the US, is further than others in that. And the next one is crisis prevention. It's all good to fight this crisis and to work it out, but do we do the right thing to prevent the next crisis? And I think there are some problems that unconventional monetary policy can have in crisis resolution, because the more you intervene, the more there is discussion about longevity of the instruments and using them for a long time, the more you postpone actually the crisis resolution, and you might contribute with that also setting the wrong incentives so that the market believes there's to put next time a crisis comes around and financial stability concerns could be there. So it's useful to look at these three crisis parts, imminent parts, ones that are more removed and ones that are in the future when you look at these tools. I think that another thing that in drawing up this panel, I was a bit bothered, or I looked at the panel and I thought there's something missing. And what is missing is when you talk about the title of this panel, Benefits and Boundaries of Unconventional Monetary Policy, I was asking myself, well, where's the cost? When you talk about benefits, you should talk about cost because it's net cost and net benefits that matter. And I think I want to talk a bit more about the cost of some of these unconventional measures and bring the third term, that is the benefits weighed against the cost, into the discussion. But let me first talk about the benefits. I think the immediate reaction, and Jean-Claude was very clear on that, to the crisis by monetary policy in 2008 was clearly beneficial. A financial meltdown was prevented, an economic depression could be avoided, and I think those that Volker Wieland quoted at the start and the coordination of those policies globally, I remember vividly many G7, IMF and other meetings where this coordination took place, almost on a day-to-day basis, deserve the gratitude for preventing this crisis. However, when you move to unconventional policies and negative interest rates, I think there is still the verdict out there whether other forms of conventional policy measures might have not also done a similar job, in particular when it comes to the longevity of these using these tools. For example, longer-term liquidity provisions, in my view, were a very important part to give financial institutions longer-term liquidity that was reliable and therefore resolved some of the uncertainty around wholesale financing that clearly was the core of this crisis. And in a bank-based system like Europe, that reliable long-term source of financing was very important for banks to be able to hold on to risk positions because they know once wholesale financing had collapsed that they could use these liquidity provisions to basically organize the sell-off of their balance sheet in a totally different fashion. I also think that the recent discussions about yield curve targeting were, as a matter of a crisis tool, you don't just focus at the very short end of the yield curve, but you go out in terms of maturity of the yield curve and bring that down to low levels, in my view, not necessarily zero or negative levels, is also something that I think over the crisis we've looked at, and these policy tools deserve looking into their beneficial and cost elements as well. So I think since we've actually moved beyond the crisis, there is very little that I am yet convinced about that basically where the central bank tools play a big role in rebuilding the house. The weak post-crisis economic recovery, in my view, is an indication of very minuscule benefits of prolonging these tools. And one of the, I think, not so great visions that I sometimes have when I read some of the academic research is the concept of QE forever. So if the economy doesn't respond, you just have to keep these crisis tools in place for a long, long period of time. And that is equivalent to basically providing some long-term stimulus. I think that is clearly not the case because of incentive initiative. The second thing that I'm not quite sure whether the second and third phase of crisis resolution and crisis prevention, these unorthodox monetary policy tools have the same benefits as in the actual crisis fighting is we have a totally different financial system. And Jean-Claude mentioned that the US system is a capital market-based system. Now almost 80% of the financing gets done through capital markets. QE has eliminated any returns on fixed income instruments. The Fed 10-year treasury purchases has really led to a massive boom in the equity markets. And it was a non-brainer in terms of trades in financial institutions that you basically de-emphasize your fixed income portfolio and you shift your portfolio investments to an equity-oriented portfolio. And with the 3-year boom in the market, and with the market going up by 30% a year, there was no at all risk in taking that trade because that policy was in place for a long time, and it helped massively US banks to recover because of their capital market business and being a very profitable business. The same thing hasn't happened in Europe because we don't have the capital market to start with. So European banks have healed much less as a result of the capital market boom, and actually because of the 0 or negative interest rates, you know, in Switzerland, even interest rates at minus 75 basis points, where the whole yield curve on the day the Swiss went off the peg went into negative territory, 65-year remaining maturity for Swiss government bonds went negative. There's very little money banks make in that environment, either on fixed income business or on maturity transformation, because the yield curve is flat, it starts in negative territory. So I do think that the differential behavior and healing of US banks versus European banks is not a coincidence, but it's the two flip sides of the same medal, that whether or not you have capital market business to rely on is a main driver of how fast you are recovering in a crisis that basically favors capital markets in the tools that are used, outright purchases, for example, and this favors fixed income markets. Now, let me talk a bit about sort of the cost. In terms of the cost of unconventional policies, you need to extract those costs from the benefits. And if you, like I, start from the presumption that actually in the second and third phase of crisis resolution and crisis prevention, the benefits aren't that high, you're easily drawn into a position where actually the net benefits might be negative, even significantly so, because I do think that the major cost of these policies do not materialize when you are in the crisis fighting. They do materialize as you exit the crisis, as you normalize the balance sheet, and as you set the right incentives for future crises, which could be much more costly because we actually have lost some of the ability to react to the crisis in the same way that we did last time. The Federal Reserve, for example, has lost many of its emergency authorities they had last time around by major intervention, by policy. And so it's not sure we're as equipped, as well equipped now in the policy arena for the next crisis as we maybe are in the private sector, where I have responsibility, where the banks have massively improved their ability to withstand the next crisis, but I don't think the crisis-fighting tools on the central banks are as much of. And there's 5 areas I want to like to focus on. The first one, unconventional policies, and Jens Weidmann mentioned that, they distort asset prices, and basically this interferes with an efficient allocation of capital, thus weakening the capital stock and, in my view, the long-term growth potential of our economies. With massive capital dislocations, you do see long-term growth impact. And when we all talk to the Chinese and we give them recipes, Christine Lagarde will be here later, that they need to rebalance away from overinvestment that is not very efficient in the domestic economy in order to export and build an export industry, but to focus that on building a service sector and a domestic economy. Exactly that overinvestment, in my view, in many areas of the economy is happening, and it has long-term growth potential. Second, the misallocation of capital on the real side is mirrored by booms, busts, and financial losses on the financial side, corresponding to risks to financial stability. And I think they are clearly visible because of the misallocation and the intermediating role that banks have played. The term non-performing loans was mentioned here. It is a prime example of how such misallocations in capital lead to weaknesses in banks' balance sheets if not resolved. The third of asset purchases and basically putting a put in the market is moral hazard. It keeps in place ineffective companies. It keeps in place ineffective governments which are overspending and live beyond their own means. And in my view, this has at least helped to postpone some of the pressure to adapt, and in that sense, moral hazard of these policies, especially in phase 2 and 3 of what I talked about, is going to be important. Fourth, and probably for me most importantly, these policies have large redistributive effects. Now, monetary policy always has redistributive effects, even if you move the interest rate around over the cycle. But if you do that not on a cyclical, because then over the cycle, these redistributive effects on average balance out. In the upper part of the cycle, they go to one side, in the lower part of the cycle to the other. But if you do the same policy for years and years on end, these redistributive effects become permanent, and they basically are multiplying each other. And if you look at how monetary policy at the zero lower bound works, the interest rate channel and actually the credit channel that basically amplifies the interest rate channel, they stop working as effectively as they do in normal times. And at the zero lower bound, monetary policy will mainly work through the wealth channel and the foreign exchange channel, increasing the wedge between those that are owners of capital and investments and those that aren't, usually labor income. I've just been to a very interesting and actually almost sort of really disturbing talk by Guy Standing, who talks about how the impact of some of the recent redistribution has been on those that are outside the labor force, on those that he calls rentier economies, so basically people that have capital and patents and live off capital income, and those that have labor income or those that have no income at all because they're outside the labor market and outside the statistics. Quite a phenomenon that in many of our economies, in my view, is probably not caused by these monetary policies, but it's amplified and supported by these policies being in place a long time. And I think to that extent, monetary policy really has to look at the fact that the growing discontent in the world, if these policies are there for very, very long times, might actually turn public opinion from looking at central banks as the ones that help solve the crisis to those that played a role in causing the next one. Last but not least, I think it is too early to argue that, or to take stock of the overall cost of unconventional measures, so part of what I'm talking about here hasn't really materialized because most of these measures are still in place. My preferred measure of the degree of expansion of monetary policy, which is the growth of the global monetary base, still growing at 12%. Monetary policy might be retreating somewhat in the US cautiously and carefully by moving interest rates away from zero and by actually talking about reducing the balance sheet. At the moment, the balance sheet is stable, but the balance sheet of the central banks in Japan and in Europe is still growing, and globally, monetary policy is still very expansionary. The repercussions in the markets that you will see is there will be a structural shorter dollar liquidity in funding markets in the future and a longer euro and yen liquidity. And so currency translation effects between yen and euro markets, which are ample liquidity, and dollar markets, which might see more restrictive liquidity, might impact on FX and other markets going forward. And that's something that sort of, as a transmission mechanism, will be more important. So because these measures are still in place, and they will only be revealed when central banks normalize interest rates and reduce their balance sheet, I think the real threat of these policies is that as we're starting to see this cost come through, it might actually further delay, if not abort, the normalization process, and a monetary policy that is expansionary for a very, very long period of time, in my view, has some risk to it, because we are at a period where I think the real economy does not need the support to walk by monetary policy. Actually postponing that withdrawal of support might actually entail a risk in itself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for these excellent statements and presentations. I think they went a little longer than we had planned, but that's okay. I'll keep my first round of questions relatively brief, so we still have 20, 25 minutes where we're open to the audience. Now, I just want to probe a little bit. Let me start with Japan. Japan, we had the long experience of QE. There was an exit once. We went back into it. What about the question of effectiveness? If I look at inflation, it hasn't worked. So what's going on? Why are we still there at low inflation in Japan? Maybe you could let us distill the advice you give on that. It seems like you've expanded the money supply in Japan, but there seems to be no connection between money and inflation.
Okay, we have been debating this issue for over 2 decades. And there are 2 issues. One is, what is the reason for low inflation? And the second is whether this is a relevant question or not. And as for the first, of course, many hypotheses are presented, but my preferred explanation is that Japanese society, they preferred to maintain employment. Therefore, at a level of society, workers accepted a lower wage in various forms. In return, management of firms tried to maintain employment. And therefore, we succeeded in avoiding massive unemployment rate. Even at the height of crisis, our unemployment rate was just 5%. But the flip side of this is lower wages, which is translated into lower inflation rate. So we have to look at the situation in totality. We should not look at inflation number in isolation. We should look at totality. But this leads me to the second question, whether low inflation rate itself is a problem for Japanese economy. As someone mentioned in the initial remarks, Japan's growth was not so bad, especially if we look at growth of working age population. Japan's growth rate was highest, much higher than that of the United States. If we look at growth of per capita income, Japan's growth rate is just average, not so good, but not so bad, as the implied word of the country suffering from deflation. And the reason why we are aiming at 2% inflation rate goal is two. One is measurement error. The other is to avoid slipping into zero lower bound of inflation rate, zero lower bound of interest rate. But I wonder whether real constraint faced by central bank is the existence of zero lower bound. And of course, it could be a constraint, but the more relevant constraint is, I would say, intertemporal budget constraint. If economy becomes too dependent on borrowing, then anyway, after bubble burst, economy have to adjust to the more sustainable growth path. In the interim, growth rate will be 10 times, even though we had negative interest rate by engineering all sorts of unconventional monetary policy, still it could just mitigate the speed of adjustment, but it could not undo the full adjustment process. So coming back to your issue, of course, the slightly higher inflation rate is better, but what is more important is more sustainable growth. In that regard, not so bad. Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to say let's focus still on the effectiveness. But so what I take from you is, well, the effectiveness on inflation, mostly driven by other factors, but it did have real effects on employment, GDP per capita. Now, I was just at Stanford at the Hoover Conference on Monetary Policy with a number of members of the Federal Reserve Board and FOMC, and I remember Charles Evans saying something like the following. I hope I don't misrepresent him, but I think that's how I heard it. He said, well, we had the crisis, we started quantitative easing in the US. In Europe, they didn't go into quantitative easing. They had a second recession. Finally, they did quantitative easing. Now they're coming out. So to Jean-Claude Trichet, is that a total misrepresentation? Is that missing the other unconventional policies you deployed? Or would it indeed have been better to go straight into quantitative easing on a massive scale in 2009?
One of the reasons why I mentioned that we had different tools and that the off-balance sheet commitment were very, very important is precisely that reason. Clearly, because we were in totally different structure of financing of the economy, the US started by QE immediately, purchase of tradable securities, did not qualify what it was doing as QE. As you know, it was an invention of market participants, naming QE. And at the very beginning, the US was mentioning, we are doing that because we want to substitute to a private sector which is not functioning correctly. So I would not share this analysis. I think it's based upon absence of full understanding of what was the European structure of financing and what was the decision which were taken by the ECB Governing Council, which were quite, again, quite bold. Now, we had another element which is of another nature, which was the, I would say, very unfortunate sovereign risk crisis. which hit the European and not the other countries for reasons that are multidimensional themselves, but that I could not help myself as president of the central bank not judging very, very largely attributed to non-respect of the Stability and Growth Pact. And I was the witness of all the meditation of the Eurogroup on this particular point during all my years, and absence of understanding what meant the loss of cost competitiveness that was absolutely obvious in all the countries that were then afterwards in the terrible sovereign risk crisis, because the two elements played their role. Some of them were dominant. For instance, it was absolutely clear for Portugal and for Greece, the absence of full respect of the Stability and Growth Pact was dominant. In other countries like Ireland and Spain, clearly we had also a problem of not understanding what meant the bubble that was emerging in their country and the loss of cost competitiveness associated with that. So I had personally, as president, full satisfaction, I have to say at the time. It's no more the case now, because Germany was regaining competitiveness, cost competitiveness, year after year. And I remember all my discussion with Otmar when we were, assessing the return of Germany to appropriate competitiveness, starting for a very miserable starting point, where Germany was not competitive at the very beginning of the euro. So, the absence of correct governance of the euro area was very much, in my understanding, the reason why we had the sovereign risk crisis. And then, of course, we were in a different universe with both, I would say, real economy problems associated with the necessary adjustment and correction, and also at the level of the euro area as a whole, a problem of both real economy being stalled and inflation too low, which was not the case, I have to say, in my time. In my time, inflation was not low at all, and we had to take into account the facts and figures that existed at that time.
Axel, you highlighted already the costs of these policies, potential risks for financial stability or misallocations that actually come from these policies. Now, that sounds to me a lot like, if we look at the situation today, that we're actually in need of getting rid of these policies or finding a way out, because maybe they're becoming part of the problem. Is that a fair judgment of where you were going? What would you say about the current situation?
So first I want to sort of add to something that Jean-Claude said, and I think this is where absolutely when we talk to our US colleagues today, we find that the understanding of what was the crisis over there and what is the crisis here is actually different, and it needs to be treated differently. This was a US crisis, the last one, 10 years around. It was a US crisis at the core of the global financial system in the market that was most exposed, which was the real estate market. Actually, you could look back at crises. Crises always have a real estate dimension because it's a very cyclical market. And when that market collapsed, you needed a different response in the US than here. We had exposures in Germany through the banking system to the US crisis because we had a moribund mortgage market for the whole 20 years after unification. There was an excess supply. So we didn't have credit growth domestically related to mortgages. But our banks went into credit derivatives. And with credit derivatives, they invested in US financial markets. And when the US financial market imploded, what Jean-Claude said, the balance sheet mismatch between SPVs that held US mortgage-backed securities and other exposures, but were wholesale financed, when the wholesale finance market turned down, that funding disappeared. And it caused subsequently, not at the same time, in 2007, when some of the German institutions had problems, it wasn't yet a problem at the European level. Spain was going strong. They still had a mortgage boom. But that market turned as the crisis became broader-based. And we in Europe had a second crisis. We had the impact of the US crisis. In those countries with strong growing mortgage markets, we had a homemade mortgage crisis. Spain is one of them. And on top of that, the more important crisis for Europe was the sovereign debt crisis that emerged only later on. So totally different set of events and how they were unfolded, and therefore a totally different response that was needed. And I don't think it had anything to do with QE. It had more to do with the fact that I think in the early phase of the crisis, we actually addressed the issue that was important, that is the collapse of wholesale funding markets and replicating them with long-term guaranteed finances through banking channels. Totally different problem now. I do think we need to exit these policies. And I think because we're now at a point where banks are all profitable again. You can talk about the degree of profitability. Some of them don't earn their cost of capital, but they're kept alive by these policies and they don't adjust. Other banks have adjusted their business model, have focused on being more profitable. And I think it is time to really start unwinding these policies, because I think we're risking otherwise that instead of helping markets to come back, central banks replace markets by putting these liquidity and other provisions in place for a too long time. You can always add another wiggle to growth. I'm not saying that that's not possible. But I think we are at a point in time where the risk and benefit balance is and has started to shift to the problem more being, in my view, that an overlong reliance on these policies rather than reconstructing markets and helping markets and bank to function. We've done a lot on regulation, and as long as you're re-regulating the industry, it continues to be an industry focused on regulation. But I think we've also achieved a lot in making the industry more resilient to the next crisis, and that, in my view, a much stronger banking system buys us the ability to normalize some of these policies, because the banking system and financial markets are now much less dependent on these policies than they were in the acute aftermath of the crisis.
Maybe before we hand over to the audience for questions, one last poll. I mean, going forward, I think there are two scenarios. One is we are actually, I mean, Japan has been in this situation now for a long time. Maybe we are in a situation where we're going to have to live with low interest rates and low inflation and all that for a long time, a new normal, and we will be deploying, or we'll have to, or central banks will have to deploy these unconventional policies all the time. They'll become conventional. So, and maybe we need to think more about what strategy for that. Or is this a temporary phenomenon and we're behind in terms of the exit? Or maybe even a third scenario, the policy itself is making it permanent. But maybe where do you see this discussion about new normal, low equilibrium interest rates, policy strategies? Yes, no, in which direction? If you can give me a quick round of answers, maybe starting from here again.
Okay. My view is it's a mixture of underlying low growth trend and policy making itself. And as for the former, there are many issues involved, including demographics. As for the second, of policy making, as I said repeatedly, the monetary easing is shifting of the timing of expenditure. So it could not change the trajectory of economy itself. But nonetheless, if we deploy monetary easing on a massive scale for a prolonged period of time, a lot of strange incentive is being created, which leads to gradual decline in potential rate. In that sense, it is own-making. So there are two elements involved.
First of all, I would say there are a number of factors that are playing against growth as we had known in the past. So this is a very important point for monetary policy. Insufficient investment since the crisis, and persistent insufficient investment. We have TFP, total factor productivity, which is extremely disappointing until now. There is a paradox, there is a conundrum then, but it is a fact. And of course, this has a weight on growth. And we have also the demographic element, which is absolutely dramatic in Japan, but exists in most of our countries, not only advanced economies, but also emerging economies. So that is there, that is a fact, and that complicates life, undoubtedly, for monetary policy. Now, we have another phenomenon, which I have to say takes, for me, a dimension which we have to fully understand, which is the diminishing bargaining power of labor, which is observed in Japan, in the US, a little less, and in Europe. And that creates, of course, an element which is extremely adverse from the standpoint of the central bank, because I trust they are right to target 2%, taking all into account if we have appropriate rebalancing of relative prices, if we have the hangover, the debt hangover for all countries, including those who are well managed, not to be too heavy. We must reach the medium, long-term, I would say, understanding of price stability at less than 2, but close to 2, at least in our case. And if despite all very good elements that I see in some countries, including Germany or the Netherlands, if despite that we do not have more than 1.5% of national inflation, to the extent that Germany is the ceiling of national inflation for the other countries because they all have, without exception, to catch up with their own cost competitiveness, we are in a situation which is extremely adverse. So clearly, when I said the central bank cannot be the only game in town, it's clear that we need the social partners on board now. And I would say it's the same in Japan. And of course, parliament and government.
So Axel, are you calculating with an equilibrium rate of 0, or are we going to get out in a positive environment?
I think there is a secular decline of interest rates and growth rates, and it's largely due to structural factors and secular factors like population growth. Yeah. World labor force growth has peaked. There are many long-term factors that have brought growth rates down over the last 20, 30 years. But I think it is absurd that when you make the proposition, which all of us agree to, that central banking policy is a great tool to fight a recession and as a counter-cyclical policy measure, it is one that acts fast and they can have an initial impact. So it is, in crisis fighting, the first tool that is used. But to then make the conjuncture that if the downturn is not cyclical, but structural or secular, to then use this cyclical tool forever, that you would gain growth traction, in my view, I haven't heard a central banker ever say that, and I don't think any central banker ever will. This comes from people that don't understand the division of labor between central banks, who are acting as a cyclical response and have financial stability responsibilities, and structural policies, the second and third arrow, where fiscal policy and structural policies need to take care of longer-term growth. And to misuse the central bank's balance sheet in trying to artificially foster growth longer term, in my view, is not a recipe for success, it's a recipe for disaster.
Well, that's a good note to ask for some more questions from the audience. Anyone has thought of something here? Barry Eichengreen, we start with him. And then, see over here, yes. I will collect, say, 3 questions and then do answers in another round.
Many of the arguments that we've heard about the costs of unconventional monetary policy and the difficulties of exiting it once you begin suggest that a 2% inflation target is too low. Would the panelists agree?
Okay. Second question here, Governor Nowotny, Fezzi, correctly?
No, too high.
He said too low.
Thank you. Yeah, it's following a bit in the same line. Considering this kind of new normal, I think in this case, one really has to distinguish between central banks that have a single mandate of price stability and central banks with a dual mandate of. So if we have this single mandate situation and we have a situation where for a relatively long period of time, inflation rates are below this goal set by the central banks. And then, whereas on the other hand, we have already quite relevant economic growth. So my questions are, first, do you see this, and this would follow what Axel Weber said, do you see this, or do you see a tendency of a long-term perspective of relatively low inflation rates? That means inflation rates below the goal set by central banks. Second, if we have such a situation, what does this really mean for the boundaries for unconventional monetary policy? And third point, could you foresee a discussion that in such a situation there would be, let's say, an easing of, or a broadening of the inflation goal in the sense of setting a range instead of setting just a clear-cut target, as I'm aware, for instance, the Swedish central bank is just now discussing about this kind of a range, which means, of course, that you would end or could end expansion in monetary policies at an early stage.
A third question, maybe, and then we. Is there no third question right now? Okay. No, good. Okay, so I think these questions were basically for the whole panel. So each of you feel free to respond briefly, and maybe in the meantime, we can think of some other questions. Otherwise, I'll get another chance. So you want to go from this side, maybe, for a change?
Well, I think the difference between an actual central bank governor and a former is that the actual central bank governor is bound by the official target. The former governor is bound by the process, how we got to it. Yeah. And so I do remember we had a discussion about inflation targets. Ottmar was there. I think to consider to just put the inflation target higher and higher so we can continue to do expansionary monetary policy for longer, in my view, kind of is reverse engineering a bad monetary policy. So I don't think it would work, and I don't think at the moment, I do not see economies be at a inflation pressure that will lead us anytime soon. What drives inflation? Inflation is driven by many factors, amongst monetary and other factors, by global output gaps increasingly rather than local output gaps. We're very far off a global output gap that is positive. We're actually still at a negative global output gap. And with China being an emerging power, these global factors become a much bigger driver of inflation rates than national factors in the past. So I don't think we will see a real economy-based global inflation pressure emerge anytime soon, and I don't see any need for revising inflation targets up. The actual question you might ask is if that is a long-term secular feature of the economy, that growth is going to be much weaker, whether weaker long-term real growth might actually sort of incentivize some countries to look in the other direction at inflation targets, whether actually the inflation target is achievable at 2%, or whether due to a weaker secular economy, a whole alignment of low levels of nominal interest rates, low levels of inflation is not more in the books than actually increasing them.
There is a paradox there because implicitly Barry is calling for higher inflation target, and I understand that maybe the other question is whether you should not reflect to go lower. And I would share the view of Axel, of course. Today, it seems to me highly theoretical to speak of a higher level of target. But I have a more philosophical response. It seems to me, and it's a very profound remark, that in the crisis, in the turmoil of the crisis, in the volatility, the permanent volatility that we had to cope with, this convergence of all central banks of the advanced economy, which had to cope with a dramatic crisis, to agree, not because we had a Basel meeting on that, but because spontaneously, each of us in its own environment concluded that, after all, 2% was probably the right and appropriate compromise. So I would take it as something which is much more important than is suspected, including by academia, in my opinion, and that we need more than ever solid anchoring of medium, long-term expectation. And as solid as possible an anchoring of inflation expectation is very important in a world which is changing, as said Axel, on a secular basis. We have immense transformation. They are injecting a lot of potential volatility. We need the central bank to be more than ever anchor of stability in an extremely volatile world, immediately volatile and potentially volatile, even more in the future, because we have not yet seen a lot of new problems. I have to say, and I conclude on that, I am absolutely amazed to see, when you look at the overall debt overhang, public and private, at a global level, as a proportion of the global GDP, you see that it augmented a lot by 25% of the global GDP from 2000 to 2007. And then again, since 2007 up to 15 or 16, a new 25%. And it is in a G30 work on shadow banking that we could put that as an evidence Of course, it's mainly because of the emerging world now stepping in and augmenting its leverage. But all taken into account, we are still in an extremely dangerous world. And I would say, even independently of our own monetary policy that have, of course, their counterproductive effect.
Okay, I try to combine the response to the Barry and the Edward. In considering how to respond to this question, I was thinking of not only economics, but also politics, sociology, and psychology surrounding 2% inflation number as a target. First of all, the central bank is responsible for price stability, which calls for some clearness with our mandate. Therefore, we announce numerical target. But I can become optimistic about precise number, I would say. First of all, measurement is a terrible task. We always talk about how to measure productive growth. The same is also true for measurement of inflation. I skip details measurement, but this is really, really daunting task. But more than that, I wonder whether having 2% inflation goal could be a safety function as a safety margin for not slipping into inflation. In retrospect, even though we had 2%, for that reason, we are faced with zero lower bound. And my worry with sticking with precise number too closely is it tends to crowd out other important considerations, such as the concern over financial institution. In that sense, we have to be more careful about psychological framing effect of having 2% number. So I'm not against 2% number, but we have to look at the situation in totality. And one more thing, listening to Barry's question, of course, I understand what you are meaning. And I often wonder why we are observing so much difference between US on the one hand and Europe or Japan on the other hand in this regard. And each society has its own social compact. In Japan, as I said, we prioritize maintenance of employment. And in US, country is more dynamic. And so given we should not forget about the difference in the social compact in considering how to frame, how to set the inflation number as target. And so that's my response. Okay.
Let me throw in a question myself. One thing Jean-Claude Trichet said, referring to the multi-pillar, the two pillars, money being one side, credit the other, and the ECB always taking that into account, and there being a majority of other institutions telling you in 2004, 2005 that, no, it's not the time to raise interest rates. This still seems to be a situation today. At least as I perceive it, there is a consensus driven more from the Fed system, from the IMF, also the ECB seems to be in that group, for me at least, which says, just like Lars Svensson, there's flexible inflation targeting, multi-policy is used to stabilize inflation and the output gap. For financial stability, we have macroprudential policy. Interest rates shouldn't be used to, multi-policy shouldn't be used to try and preempt or prevent a buildup. We deal with that with macroprudential policy. So it's preemptive, but it's macro-pru, and multi-policy should stay with its business because it's been fine doing flexible inflation targeting. Seems very different, and maybe all three of you want to respond to that, but what would you say?
No, when you look at figures, and particularly at the M3 dynamics and at the overall credit dynamics, I don't think you can say that you have elements, particularly on credit, in the euro area that are alarming. I wouldn't say that. I would say that we are progressively, slowly, but progressively going back to probably what would be considered as normal. It might change. I don't exclude that we will observe an acceleration of real growth in Europe. It is really in the cards, and we could see that because, when the IMF was still saying they will grow by 1.7%, it was published in April this year. Now we probably agree that 2% is, after particularly the 0.6% of the first quarter, is more in the cards. So it is accelerating. I am very happy with that. And normally it should transmit to the second pillar, observing the dynamism of the second pillar. So again, I think we have to respect facts and figures. But I wouldn't say that in my eyes, the ECB has abandoned the two-pillar strategy. It is not the case as far as rhetoric is concerned, and it seems to me it's not the case as regards the decision of the Governing Council.
Do you want to say anything on the macro-pru versus multi-policy leaning against the wind in this area? No?
I understand the argument behind expansion, but this argument rests on the assumption that each goals are independent, price stability and financial stability. But I don't think these two goals are independent, heavily interrelated. This argument reminds me of the argument back in 1980s in Japan. At that time, on average inflation rate in bubble period in Japan was less than 1%, but exactly during this period, a lot of debt was being created, which eventually led to the bursting of bubble, which eventually led to decline in prices. So over the longer time horizon, just sticking with raising inflation rate led to a little bit decline in inflation rate. So my sense is both stability and financial stability are two faces of the same coin of achieving the stability of money. And one is the time dimension of one, the former price stability is a bit short, say 2 or 3 years. And the time dimension of financial stability is much longer, but eventually these are unrelated. And given that, I'm uncomfortable with a dichotomy between the monetary policy and macro-prudential policy or the financial and supervision policy in a narrow sense. Yeah.
I think you wouldn't be surprised that I hold related to your question, a similar view that you expressed in the question, and that is, I think particularly if you look at what the Fed was doing over recent quarters, when they were giving guidance for interest rates moving away from zero and normalization, the word data dependent very often came in as a reason not to raise rates. Because the economy was soft, we were going through some soft patches. I think the Fed has now largely de-emphasized this data dependence and will continue on a steady path to normalize monetary policy, including giving some guidance for the balance sheet. So it's going to be the first central bank that will move to more normal rates. They will reduce the size of the balance sheet. And the only question that I think they're still discussing is what is going to be the mix between interest rate changes and balance sheet reductions. Because, remember when they did QE, they talked about the interest rate equivalent of a balance sheet augmentation. So clearly, as that provided tailwinds for capital markets, there's going to be headwinds coming from reducing the balance sheet and raising rates. So it might be largely a substitute for raising rates further once they are and actually seeing the 10-year rate in the US come off 2.5% towards 2.2, tells you that the market increasingly is looking less at interest rate changes going forward, but more at balance sheet reduction. And I think that is healthy. And for the US, I see very little risk. The US has become the preeminent global currency again. Global capital is coming back from Europe and from everywhere going into the US economy. So the US can finance a lot of what the capital market was doing and where the Fed was supporting in the future by attracting growth of global capital. There is a big question mark about that, and that is, does the US course of policies provide sufficient continuity for this to be the case? And if you ask me where I'm most concerned, which I think is not monetary policy, it is a certain disconnect that we're starting to see again, and this is always the cause of problems, between financial markets where volatility is at an all-time low and the perception of uncertainty that is probably, particularly related to policy uncertainty in the major constituencies of the world, that is probably at an all-time high if you look at some of the US polls that look at political uncertainty. And the only way you can reconcile that low level of volatility with a high level of uncertainty is that the market somehow believes that if problems should erupt, the central banks are going to back in and fix the problem. And that's sort of, just to finish on that note, that is something we need to seriously look at, because if that were true, then the ability of the current policy choices to be a good crisis prevention set of choices is largely undermined, because then we created a kind of strong disincentive for markets to really focus on risk and pricing risk adequately, and any mispricing of risk, in particular if it's broad-based and global, has always been the core of financial market disruptions and of problems in financial markets. So I think this focus on really trying to get it right on the exit and on the future incentives needs some more work, rather than engineering the actual exit, which I think the Fed has largely mapped out.
Ramon, you had signaled you want to ask maybe a final question from the audience? No? Yes? Very brief. And maybe Harry Stellas, I see in the back, just very brief. So, Ramon?
The mandate has not changed, but central banking certainly has changed. And maybe I'm just translating your words. But one way that changed is to think that now it can behave like a large hedge fund, which might be a very good idea in times of crisis, but might not be a good idea in the long run. Is that the interpretation of your words?
And then I think in the back was Harry Stellas. Did I see that right? You want to say something brief?
Yes. Thank you. So John Taylor has argued that if individual countries follow the Taylor rule, there's no reason for international policy cooperation or coordination. But we've been in an unconventional monetary policy regime. So my question is, does this imply that we have a stronger case now for more policy coordination in the future? I mean, what is your view? Where are we heading?
Maybe some brief answers from your view, whoever wants to start.
On the second question, let's not forget that at the level of the, I would say, intimacy between the central banks, we are at an extraordinarily close level. I mean, we meet, and they meet. I forget that I'm not a central banker anymore. They meet so frequently. They have permanent contact. They exchange permanent views. And so they can incorporate in their own decision-making what the other partners are thinking, their diagnosis, the way they are looking at it. And it worked really fantastically rapidly in the crisis. In the crisis, we could be in contact on a, I would say, half-day to half-day basis, and we could devise, after 2 days and a half, a global first communication with global market, with a swap of currencies, which was, demonstrating that there was really a pilot in the cockpit when the governments themselves were absolutely incapable to take any decision, and when in the US itself, the Treasury mantra was, we are living in a market economy country, and it is normal that there are, balance sheets, bankruptcies. And that was, the normal reference for the Treasury. So it seems to me that we are not only very exceptionally taking decisions together. We did that on interest rate in the crisis to have a very powerful symbolic decision. But I think that we are in a permanent regime of very close exchange of views, which facilitates really the taking into account of the reverberation of the decision we are all taking. That is true for the advanced economy, should be true for all economies, and including, of course, the emerging world. And maybe we have some progress to be made in this domain, yeah.
I'm a deep skeptical of driverless cars and Tesla moments for central banks. So I don't really think that we can replace central bank boards by some artificial intelligence and really rely, like with cars, on driverless cars, because the rules on the road where you go one direction are very simple, and there is boundaries on both sides. You can get that done. Where you have to watch it is with crossings. But In central banking, it's a much more complex set of rules, and I'm very doubtful that a simple rule can replace the adequacy of reacting to situations which we've all seen. Most of our, as I recall it, work as central bankers has not been dominated by understanding what we need to do if everything happens according to plan. I think we always knew how to behave then. The issue was, how do you deal with things that don't behave according to plan? And that's where I think you need the benefit of a committee. That's where you need the benefit of reflection and interaction. And I don't think that this can be replicated by a simple rule, nor by policy coordination that is redundant because we all follow simple rules. I don't think it would work. Okay. And I really haven't understood the question, so I can't answer really on the first one.
As for the second question of the second the speaker, and I strongly agree with what Jean-Claude said. And each country, each central bank is, of course, mandate of each central bank is, of course, domestic stability. And so it is unrealistic for each central bank to pursue global stability from the beginning. And given that, the very close communication among central banks, especially in emerging economies, is a crucial asset. That is one thing. And the second thing is we have to pay more attention to the discussion on financial supervision, regulation, and payment system, etc. And one case in point is the effort at eliminating settlement risk due to time difference in foreign exchange. Just a few years before global financial crisis, new systems started, mainly because of the deliberate effort on the part of central banks. Without having this system in place, I think foreign exchange market would have been faced with disaster. But because of this attempt, we succeed in maintaining reasonable functioning of foreign exchange market. And this is a very product of close communication, cooperation among central banks. Yeah.
Thank you. Please join me in a round of applause for our three panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Volker. Pleasure.
Okay. Thank you.